Welcome to Hash It Out, a podcast built by data security experts. We decipher the data security landscape through honest conversations about today's headlines and tomorrow's challenges. Brought to you by Virtru. Let's dive in.
On this episode of Hash It Out, host Matt Howard sits down with Virtru's Jimmy Lemkemeyer and Everfox's David Flanagan to unpack ACP 240, data-centric security, and the future of how allied nations share sensitive data across domain boundaries. Let's hash it out.
Good afternoon. My name is Matt Howard. Welcome to another episode of Hash It Out, a podcast built by a group of folks who are obsessed about protecting data. I'm your host, and today I have the privilege of having two terrific guests and true experts in their fields. We'll be talking about ACP 240 in action, data-centric security for the mission partner environment. With me today are Jimmy Lemkemeyer. Jimmy, would you mind introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about what you do at Virtru?
Yeah, absolutely. Excited to be here. As Matt said, I'm Jimmy Lemkemeyer, solutions architect here at Virtru. So really focused on working with customers and designing their specific solutions for DCS, and particularly involved with ACP 240 and a lot of the standards conversations that are happening right now. I was working for the Department of Defense before this, doing similar stuff. So yeah, very excited to be here.
Awesome. Great to have you. And David Flanagan, aka Flash from Everfox. Would you be so kind as to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Everfox and what you're doing there?
Sure, pleasure to. So similar to Jimmy, I'm also a solutions architect within Everfox. And again, very, very similar. What we're about doing is understanding the desire of the customer, what outcomes are they after, and how does our technology fit, indeed where it doesn't fit, where they need to introduce different types of technology, but really very much from my perspective about aligning with those customer outcomes. And then, as Jimmy says, one of those key areas is interoperability and collaboration across coalition partners in many, many different dimensions. From a personal point of view, in terms of background, I've spent, I think it's nearly 35 years in this space, dealing with those sorts of interoperability and collaboration challenges at differing classifications across different partner nations, different organizations, etc. And it's helping to shape our customers' understanding of what they're trying to achieve based on that experience. So, pleasure. Looking forward to a great conversation.
Yeah, well, thank you for being here. That word interoperability is one that is certainly front and center in the context of the conversation we want to have today. To kind of kick things off, you both know way better than I do, and as experts in the field, it's been 30 years, and for practical purposes, the way the national defense organizations, intelligence organizations have been sharing data across domain boundaries, as you said, Flash, and with coalition partners, has largely been sort of a network and hardware-centric sort of path to that interoperability. The pace of sharing data seems to be accelerating. I'm just kind of curious, how would you look at interoperability maybe a decade ago versus how are you looking at it at a high level today? What's changed with respect to interoperability? I'll start with you, Flash.
Okay, cool, thanks. So from my point of view, in terms of how I delivered interoperability 30, 35 years ago, as you say, there was a very strong focus on building an infrastructure that was specific to the community of interest, to the classification, to whatever the coalition of the willing was that was needing to be served by that information sharing capability. Obviously, that leads to massive proliferation of multiple infrastructures, which increases the complexity and the challenge around interop and collaboration outside of any one of those communities of interest, any one of those specific platforms. I think over the intervening period of time, what we've seen is a recognition of that complexity, a recognition of where that constrains the ability to share and to interoperate, but also at a simple level, where it costs a huge amount of money and time and resource, and that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, super interesting. So Jimmy, I'm curious, from your perspective, how do you think about interoperability, in the past versus today? And to the point that Flash just raised, it's really interesting to think about friction in the mission versus just hard cost, both probably important. I'm curious to get your perspective on interoperability with that light.
Yeah, and I think Flash is exactly right here. One of my favorite analogies is kind of how closely the world of cybersecurity has paralleled the evolution of cybersecurity, and the idea that traditionally security within cities was done by city walls, with ancient Rome, ancient Athens, those types of cities, and kind of similar to what Flash was talking about in terms of building individual walls for individual environments and kind of that network-centric security. And over time, as cities grew and grew, they grew too large eventually to be defended by walls, which is kind of where what we're seeing right now with this whole zero trust movement. And how do you do security when you don't have walls, and how do you enable cities to connect more closely and more interoperable, or be more interoperable without walls? And so that's really where ACP 240 comes along, and a lot of the TDF types of formats, which I'm sure we'll get into in a bit. But I think Flash is exactly right here.
So then you mentioned ACP 240, and I mean, just to put this in context, I think both of you said some version of the same thing: interoperability. 2 different domains, 5 different domains, 10 different domains. I think Flash said the coalition of the willing. The idea that defense and security from a nation state perspective involves sharing of sensitive information with multiple partners across domain boundaries is understood. The pace at which that sensitive information can be shared seems to have accelerated because the mission itself seems to be more temporal, more dynamic. Who your partner today may not be your partner tomorrow. That whole concept of sort of temporal, ephemeral sort of domain boundaries makes everything more complicated, to the point that Flash made. So when you guys think about that, what is ACP 240? Why has it become a topic of conversation? What's driving ACP 240? And in a nutshell, explain it for us and share your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I'm happy to start with this one, and would love to get Flash's thoughts too. So ACP 240 obviously is centered around this idea of the zero trust data format, or ZTDF, and that is a format kind of derived from the initial ICTDF, which is a standard that came out of the U.S. intelligence community, and then Virtru created OpenTDF, which is an open source platform that took that and added kind of a cryptographic approach to that, and all of that became effectively, ACP 240 derived from that to create this idea of ZTDF. So ACP 240 is a standard that was developed by the Five Eyes CCEB, and really defines out that standard. And why I think that's really important right now is, the industry for a while had agreed on this kind of concepts behind data-centric security and the desire to move away from network-centric security to data-centric security. But you had a lot of different vendors that had kind of created and were implementing a lot of different approaches that were not necessarily interoperable or aligned. And ACP 240 is really the start of a standard that allows everyone to get on the same page, and develop solutions, or develop towards solutions that have that interoperability and alignment.
And by everyone is currently the Five Eyes, or who is everyone?
Yeah, so the ACP 240 is an open standard that obviously anyone can adhere to and develop towards. It was initially created by the CCEB, which is a Five Eyes organization or alliance. And I think right now we can get into in a bit in terms of what the future of that looks like. But you have individuals at NATO who are right now considering developing a similar standard that would kind of expand it out further. But right now it's really a Five Eyes standard.
So Flash, what's your view of the ACP 240 sort of topic today, and perhaps your view on it as it moves forward?
Yes. So if I were to think about it in terms of why does it matter, I think Jimmy's hit the nail on the head there. It's that creation of a standard that provides the framework against which multiple partners, multiple vendors, multiple agencies, whatever the nature of that agency is, they can work to a known standard that's documented and ratified across partners. Also, as Jimmy noted, the fact that the ACP comes out of a CCEB, but is cognizant of NATO standards and where they fit into that framework, again, extends the reach of that as a series of coordinated, coherent standards where we can start with a basic foundation and then build up over time to something that's more complex, more capable as required.
Interesting.
Yeah, a key point you hit on, Flash, in terms of the ACP 240 integrating those NATO standards like 4774 and 4778 and 5636, all those different standards.
Exactly that.
So,
I was just going to say, Matt. One of the other things that's worth bearing in mind from an ACP 240 point of view is that documentation and standardization of data-centric security as a thing then allows the creation of data-centric interoperability and infrastructure as an active, reasonable capability. And that ability to build on standards to actually create something that people can then use is really important going forward.
Well, that was going to be my next question. So my understanding is, there is this effort among, the coalition of the willing to kind of get on the same page with respect to a standard in a technical sense that will enable that collection of partners, mission partners across these countries. And as they kind of align on the standard, what is the shift that then happens from network-centric to data-centric security? Like, what does that look like? And what do they gain as a result of having the standard and allowing themselves to get on the same page? Like, what's the benefit to the mission?
So from in my humble opinion perspective, there is a need to be cautious because some people jump in a particular direction. But if you accept that DCS, data-centric security, enables that much more fine-grained access control than was typical with low sophistication network-centric security. So exactly as Jimmy was describing before, if you create a city, put some walls around it, but you trust everything else inside, that's not very sophisticated. And again, looking back over the past few decades, there have been sporadic instances of building infrastructures that within the infrastructure, there is the proprietary delivery of attribute-based access control, however those attributes are defined and however it's implemented. What we're seeing with DCS and with ACP 240 is actually moving away from those proprietary models into something that is much more standardized. I think it's fair to say that in an entirely trivial perspective, you can see NCS network-centric security as a bucket into which there is no control once you're inside the bucket. It's just an access puddle of data that you get into there. That ability to overlay attributes on that and say, okay, not only do I have to be able to actually reach the bucket, but once I'm there, those things that are who I am, my clearances, my nationality, mapped against the classification, the releasability of the object becomes really, really important. What I would add though, what I would add and where the caution is though, is that the security of the network, as opposed to network-centric security, is still valid and shouldn't be thrown away. DCS builds on top of security of network, security of system. It's not a replacement, it's an augmentation.
Yeah. I mean, zero trust is a control plane, and it historically includes, identities, endpoints, networks, and data,
Yeah.
So Jimmy, from your perspective, kind of just, I don't know, any additional thoughts you want to add to that? I mean, like what is the practical benefit in a world that you can possibly envision where the standard is adopted and implemented in real world technical terms? What's the benefit?
Yeah, I mean, I think I completely agree with Flash that caution is important here. You don't want to jump too far ahead or get too far ahead of ourselves. But just to carry on with that analogy of city walls, because I think as Flash noted, I think it has some depth here. But to Flash's point, within specific cities, there have been instances of folks designing individual, attribute-based systems or proprietary closed solutions to allow for somewhat of a DCS solution within a network-centric solution. So almost some environment within a city wall. I think what you have with ACP 240 and the idea of TDFs is really doing security at the most granular level. So the ability to encrypt or protect individual data objects, whether that's a Word document, Excel, table, whatever your data object may be. So you're effectively locking down individual packages or individual houses or kind of the smallest level within the city of things. And when you do that in a way that's agreed upon by all of, globally, effectively, or among allied nations, you do it in a way that allows cities to effectively send packages or send things between each other in a way that they know how to open them and decrypt them and whatnot. So you can think of almost like the postal code system. If you have that in the UK and the US, but they don't understand the other country's postal code system, you can't send mail between them because there's no way to interpret that or interoperate with that. But having a standard that's unified and understood by all parties and practiced by all parties really unlocks a lot of that interoperability that solves a lot of use cases.
How when you think about the journey that you've been on for, I think you mentioned 20, 30 years now, and you've seen the evolution, how is data protection and more granular policy control, where the policy travels with the data across boundaries, how does that allow for zero trust to become a practical reality? I mean, I don't want to be hyperbolic, but I've been in the industry a long time myself, and I've heard for years now this concept of zero trust. And I think in some situations it's nice to say, but it's also, as I've come to learn, very hard to actually do it well in the true end-to-end sense. I'm just kind of curious, is this an important part of the longer term journey to real zero trust?
Absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt. So if you take the view that DCS is strongly aligned with the identity and data pillars within zero trust, then what you've got with ACP 240 giving you a standards-based model to approach that is a way that allows the pervasive control across the entire ZTA zero trust architecture of how your data is moved, how identity is managed. Those things are very, very tightly intertwined.
Yeah. And to your earlier point, it's by itself, it is a pillar, but in aggregate with identity, with endpoints, with networks and applications, they are the pillars, plural, that would enable, zero trust as a practical reality.
Yes, and if we recognize that zero trust is indeed a journey, not an endpoint, then adopting the mechanisms that enable DCS in a standards-based mechanism they are some of the waypoints on that ZT journey. The wrapping of encryption from a DCS point of view, allowing as you mentioned a little while ago, that to travel with the data across domain boundaries in the context of zero trust, where you've got that need to say, okay, this subject, this object, if you're going to police that, you need to know what are the attributes of the subject, what are the attributes of the object, and do they allow for the permission to access? That is fundamentally what DCS is about. And extending that across domain boundaries, across partners, across organizations, coalitions, etc. If I've got that extra layer of encryption that Jimmy mentioned earlier, it gives you that sovereign control being respected as you move along that journey.
Yeah, super interesting, because we started the conversation with the word interoperability, where information can move across domains perhaps more seamlessly than it has in the past and keep pace with the mission. But you just introduced the concept of sovereignty, which itself is, I think, equally critical. When the world is temporal and partnerships are ephemeral, I would like to have some sort of sovereignty over my sensitive data so that I can control it as the case may warrant, is a really interesting concept for sure. Jimmy, when you think about that, interoperability and sovereignty in the context of something like ACP 240 and TDF, and you can kind of envision where the world, clearly, I think we all want to be appropriately cautious here and not get too far over our skis. But if you at least think about that as a potential future state, what would you sort of advise an architect or a program manager to be thinking about to kind of get their feet on the ground today to at least prepare for that potential future? How should they be thinking about this conversation?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, one thing back to Flash's response, and then I want to jump into that question is I think I completely agree with everything Flash said. The only other thing I would note is by just having PDPs or kind of a data-centric solution within one environment, you allow for within a city wall DCS, but really you need that integration and that connection with the CDSs, with cross-domain solutions, to allow for those, locked boxes to transit out of those city walls. If you think of CDSs or the, one use case of CDSs being effectively a gate within the city wall, allowing that gate to recognize and understand and deal with these locked packages is really critical to allow for that interoperability, but between environments. And so that's really, I think, one of the cool things. I think we can get into that in the future, but kind of how when you make these CDS solutions and these PDP and Virtru's DSP work together, really, a lot of the cool things that unlocks. But to your point, Matt, in terms of today, what should folks be looking at? I think there's a number of different things. I mean, one of the pain points we most typically see with folks when we start engaging with them and they want to go on this kind of DCS journey is thinking that it's just kind of there's a silver bullet, there's one technology you install and it's all fixed. You have zero trust and data-centric security. And really it's a much longer journey and more of a mindset shift in terms of how you look at security, how you have to look at data and the work involved there. So I think the first thing would be understanding that at the highest level and really getting the right partners on board to be able to kind of go through that journey with you. The other thing more specifically is data tagging. I think without having tags on data or attributes associated with data, it's you really can't do data-centric security. There's no way to validate the access, whether someone should or shouldn't have access. So that's kind of the first step on the journey. Folks who want to start going down that road is ensuring they have the right framework and the right governance in place and have the right tags and attributes within their governance to be able to start doing that data tagging.
To that point, is it reasonable to expect that if that's sort of part of the journey, is it reasonable to expect on the other side of the policy that folks largely have identities and entitlements sort of figured out at this point? Or is that something that they also have to kind of make sure they have in order?
I mean, I'm sure Flash has an opinion on this too. I think we see organizations and agencies and groups, companies, in all different stages of their journey. Certainly the more advanced ones are way past that step and have a lot more figured out. But we also see folks who are still struggling to have a unified identity system and have all their identities organized. So that's another key component.
So Flash, for you, and maybe we can plan to kind of wrap this up with this last question. But I think you have a history in the space and have seen the journey to this point over decades. And I guess my question for you is, as given your expertise and view of the world, if you were speaking to an architect, who was in the shoes of the customer and really kind of getting ready for the next phase of this journey, what would be your best advice to them in terms of just preparing?
So I think Jimmy's hit on some of the key things there. If you were to make sure as an architect that you understand your information architecture, information management, understand the partners, the stakeholders, the fluidity of those communities as we've talked to, the risk and the threat profile of the environment you're working in, whether what you need to do is get eyes on the data or move the data, so access or transfer is key. But then exactly as you said, in terms of some of the challenges we've got coming up, that tagging and labeling is really, really a significant piece of work that needs to be addressed. And if I cast my mind back 25, 30 years, we had humans doing the labeling. In fact, going back many more years than that. And that works fine in an exercise environment. In the real world, it gets a bit stressy and it never happens. Now, looking at the volume of data we have now, the velocity of that data, trying to put a human in that loop is just difficult. So how is a future-looking architect or a current-looking architect, how are they planning to enable that tagging? What is their information management policy they're going to implement, and technically how are they going to achieve it to do that? Recognizing that we have standards 240, 4744, 4778, but they themselves are also evolving, and therefore being able to be agile in your solution whilst maintaining robustness in the solution will be really, really important. The final thing that's always in the back of my mind that has happened over the past 3-4 years is that traditionally interoperability and collaboration has talked about multi-domain, so land, sea, airspace, cyber, talked about cross-classification. We're increasingly seeing whole of society. That massively increases the reach against which these things have to work. That is another challenge that current architect is going to need to be looking at. What does my information access, information consumption policy look like? Not today, but in 3 years' time, 5 years' time. Am I architecting for that right sort of model?
Yeah, interesting. Well, it is fascinating for me from where I sit, because I'm nowhere near the customer journey as you two are, and yet from where I sit, I can sort of see a broad sort of architectural shift that's happening, larger than national defense and intelligence communities. It's commercial, it's banking, it's insurance, it's cyber in a horizontal sense, is really beginning to contend with, in many respects, a vastly different reality today. And therefore, I think a lot of architects and a lot of organizations around the world right now are having to kind of reconcile some of those exact same things that you guys just mentioned on the journey to true zero trust, on the journey to true data-centric security. And I very much appreciate both of you being here today and sharing your expertise and your thoughts. And with that, thank you for joining this episode of Hash It Out, and we look forward to talking to you guys again in the future. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a 5-star review and don't miss us the next time we hash it out. Like, follow, and subscribe to us on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, all linked below.